Welcome, colleagues, to the third edition of the deep dive into the Wealth of Nations Adam Smith publications. We are having a third episode this afternoon. We had a second episode in the morning part of today. Moderating this session, my name is Jotham Chacha. I'll be having my colleagues who will be delving into each of the chapters of book one. We are still dealing with book one, remember. Book one has 11 chapters, so we're still on that space, but we hopefully will be able to get done with book one today. I have a number of my colleagues who will be handling different chapters. Let me take this opportunity to introduce them. And please, my colleagues, feel free to turn on your cameras. We'll have Vivian, will be handling chapter 8, wages of labor. We'll have Jairus, will be handling chapter 9, profits of stock. We'll have Fiona, will be handling chapter 10, wages and profits in the different employments of labor and stock. And to wrap it up for today, we'll have Emmanuel, who will be handling chapter 11, rent of land. My colleagues feel welcome as we delve into this. We are seeking to answer or to respond to two important issues when we review the Wealth of Nations publication. One, what arguments and observations is Adam Smith trying to make? And two, are the proclamations relevant today? And we agree with the proclamations. So I'll welcome Vivian to begin the afternoon session, and she's focusing on wages of labor. Vivian.
Okay, thank you very much, Jotham. So I'll take you through chapter 8. So in chapter 7, we looked at something very important, just a brief background. So in chapter 7, we saw different type of prices, the natural price and the market price. So we are still continuing. We are understanding more about the natural prices, the components of the natural prices. And one of them is wages of labor. So Adam Smith starts by telling us bringing us to a world where no one had acquired enough goods that to need to hire workers, and also land and property had not been into private hands. So that was a scenario. At that point, wages were total output of labor. So if you work, or maybe the produce of labor constituted of the natural recompense or wages of labor. So the whole produce of the labor belonged to the laborer. So at that point where goods were not, properties like land was not privatized and people had not acquired enough goods to hire workers, everything someone produced, they could be rewarded for it. But we are no longer living in that world. So in this modern world, or something that he said was now in the modern world, we find that wages is now divided into three things. It is a share of, not wages, but output. It divided into a share of wages, profits, and rent. So, and in this scenario, we find two contention here. So you find the boss or the employer, he wants to give as little as possible so that he may accumulate more. Then the worker also want to earn as much as possible. So that is what is happening. And during his time, he explains to us, he's telling us that wage bargaining during his time was unequal because employers had more bargaining power as compared to employees. At that point, the employers were able to form unions because they were less in numbers. The law allowed them to organize those unions and bargain for lower wages. But employees during those times, they didn't have such. And another advantage that the workers, or not the workers, but the employers had, was they had stock. And and we see there's a difference when we come to today. One thing we realize nowadays, even workers have unions that they can form to bargain for higher wages. So things have changed. During his time, only the employers were able to form unions to bargain for lower wages. But at this time, things are different. We have unions for workers. We have union for teachers in Kenya, for example. They can bargain for higher wages. Then he brings us now what determines wages. So there are two things he explains, two things that determines wages. The first one is the demand for labor. So when there's high demand for labor, it results to higher wages. So for example, when there's expanding industries like in Britain during the early industrial growth, so increased demand for labor or for workers led to higher or rising wages. So one of the things that drives wages up is the high demand for labor. Then another thing is economic growth, which is another key driver. So the condition of the workers in economy depends on whether the economy is in three states. Number one, whether it is growing, it is stagnant, or declining. So when an economy is growing, like we were given an example of England. During that industrial revolution, England was progressing. There was rising wages. And as the wages rose, improving workers' condition. Then he gave another contrary opinion. So for this, you will just allow me to read a quotation here. So he gave an example of China. During that state, China had a problem. So first, he says that China has been long one of the richest, that is, one of the most fertile, best cultivated, most industrious, and most populous countries in the world. It seems, however, to have been long stationary. So China's condition, it was long stationary. And what did that result into? So number one, the population was growing, growth was limited, and wages remained low. And he explains in the same paragraph that the poverty of lower ranks of the people in China far surpasses that of the most beggarly nations in Europe. In the neighborhood of Canton, many hundreds, it is commonly said that many thousand families have no habitation. So they were it was one of the richest, but because it was stagnant, it led to a problem. The poverty levels, people were not able, the wages were below. They were not able to vent. If you continue with that, we are told that the subsistence which they find there is so scanty that they were eager to fish up the nastiest garbage thrown overboard from the European ship. Then he concludes by saying in this paragraph, marriage was encouraged in China during that time, not by profitableness of children, but by the liberty of destroying them. So the situation was so bad. The, the country was not growing, it was stagnant, and people were suffering to an extent that their wages were below what could sustain them. To an extent that when people gave birth to children, the law allowed them to kill the children, destroy the children. They had the liberty to kill them. So that is what can happen if wages are really low. Then, in as much as there's that bargaining power, and there was that bargaining power where employers could bargain for lower wage, there's a line below which wages should not surpass, and it is called the subsistence level. So wages must be able to sustain workers. For the case of China, the wages were too low to sustain the workers. To an extent, they were not able to raise families. They were eating carcasses. They were killing their children because they were not able to sustain their families. So we are told that there's a level below which wages should not surpass, the subsistence level. So we are told that if wages fall below this level, human well-being collapse, and we have seen that in the case of China. Workers are living bare subsistence, and those are evidence of economic stagnation. So people are forced into extreme survival behaviors. So we have seen that. So the bargaining power is okay, but there's a level below which wages should not surpass. Then he brought in another concept whereby high wages signals prosperity and not a problem. So when there's rising wages, there's strong demand for labor, and that equals to economic growth. So it says that when labor is so well rewarded and numerous children, instead of being a burden, they become a source of opulence and a source of prosperity to the parents. So I remember we remember certain scenario in history where there are some people who believe that high population and many children is not a sign of prosperity. But we are seeing here, Smith is telling us that rising wages leads to a strong demand for labor and a strong economic growth. Then, to continue on that, it brings in another concept that is very important for us to understand is that high wages in a growing region are normally seen as a sign of expansion and opportunities. So when there's high wages, it means there's a healthy, the economy is healthy and it is not in a crisis. And therefore, it concludes by telling us demand for workers must be accompanied by an increase in funds for paying those labors. And these funds normally comes in forms of revenue and stock. So for a country to be considered as prosperous and wealthy, so it means that there's an increase in demand for workers. So then he makes a powerful conclusion that if the wages are too low that someone cannot sustain a family, that someone cannot be able to raise children, he raises a question that with the growth, he raises a question that where will the next generation of workers come from if the wages that are being paid today to the parents are not even able to raise families? Then he says that without growth, high population is a curse. So he brings a concept that when there's growth, like the case of China, it was growing, it was populous. The population was growing, but the economy was stagnant. So it was a curse to them because people were not able to raise families. People were not able also to even find enough resources for their upkeep, and it led to death of families, death of children, and also they were considered among the poor in as much as they were the richest because of lack of growth. So that is the whole concept we are being told in this chapter, chapter 8 of the wages of labor. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivian. Thank you, Vivian, for that deep dive. We'll be coming back to you in the closing sessions for your final remark. Let me now invite Jairus, who will be taking us through profits of stock. That is chapter 9 of book 1. Jairus.
Okay, thanks, Jordan. So Vivian has covered on wages, and Adam Smith connects immediately after wages. Now he looks at the profits of stock, which in today I would call a capital. And he starts by making this argument that the same causes that the same things that cause the increasing or the declining of the wealth of a society are the same that causes the rise or the fall in the wages of labor. But he adds and says that though the causes are the same, but they affect these two differently. So what affects, in other words, what affects the rise or decline, the increase or decline of wages of labor, as Vivian has taken us through, though today we have more challenges and more, and actually she explained that we have unions now that even have challenged those assumptions, and therefore they matter in the amounts of the wages that their members take home. So he makes the argument that the causes for the increase or the decline are the same, but now the effect is different, it's the opposite. Specifically here, he reminds us that when wages go up, what capitalists, these investors take home now reduces, because wages now cut into their profits. And then he explains further that where we have more people investing in the same trade, in the same businesses, and therefore a lot of things come up. They are competing for the same labor, so that will drive the cost of labor up. That's wages, because of the demand. But when demand for labor goes up, of course, to be able to get the most out of that competition, then wages have to go up. At the same time, now when we have so when we have more people investing in the same trade, in the same businesses, and that creates competition. So we're competing for the same market, then we are competing for the same employees. So prices, of course, I hope that will be discussed again in another chapter. So prices will go down, and then the cost of that's wages are now rise, and so therefore that will affect the stock of capital. And then I don't know if this has been challenged, but I know in our discussion before we complete this book, we'll share this. He says that ascertaining the average profits is hard. And it is, because we are talking of an economy, a whole country. For Britain, yeah, it was a number of millions. And even today, if you talk of Kenya today, we are talking of millions of entities. That's farms and people in business, and so that would be a lot. So he says that that's hard to ascertain the average profits. And he gives very interesting reasons that still will apply today, that they keep fluctuating. So that he gives the example that if you asked one person in business the average profit they made over several years, one thing that will come out clearly is that they're always changing. Today you are getting higher profits, and the next time you're getting lower profits. And for Smith, he says, which would be true, that it's affected by changes in prices. And you see now when prices, when we have that changes in prices, the margins also change. That's the margins for profits. And the fortunes of rivals of customers. So what happens when the people consume the products that you've invested in, that you're serving, the market you're serving, and also what happens to those competing with you. So that you look at it in this way, that when things are perfect for your rivals, they could be doing lesser, they could lower their prices. And now if you stick with the higher prices, then your guess is good as mine. Or if the other way, whereby maybe the production goes down, and therefore there's more demand for your products, then we're going to have a situation where the demand will push prices up and therefore the margins. And other things which he calls accidents that may happen during storage and distribution. So having said that, it's really hard to ascertain the average points to average profits of stocks. He tells us that we could look at the interest of money, which are these are the interest rates for maybe borrowing, that's for borrowing, that they could tell us something about the profits. And to just quote him here, he says that it may be laid down as a maxim that wherever a great deal can be made by the use of money, a great deal will commonly be given for the use of it. And that wherever little can be made by it, less will commonly be given for it. I think here clearly he's talking about returns. That's returns on investment. I think he will discuss that later and we'll see, because there's a point also he makes that where returns are low, maybe you are in different sectors or in different trades, and then the returns in the other sector, in the other trade are lower, what these people, investors, can do is that they will shift their stocks from where we have less returns to where there are better returns. And again, as he argues, as we'll see, that can even happen between markets, whereby people would prefer to put their money even in foreign countries if the returns in those countries are higher. So the same way that profits of stocks increase or reduce, the fluctuation, the same happens to interests, that the interest rates. And in his words, he says that it sinks if it sinks as it sinks. So profits on stocks will sink if interest rates sink. That if they go down, the profits will go down. But again, the same, that is the rates. But on the amounts, on the total, we'll be able to see what he says later in the chapter. That's chapter 9 of book 1. So as I've indicated, that Smith tells us that looking at these interest rates, and for our case at the moment now, I think in this generation we could look at the CBR rates, the central bank rates, which act like the standard rates. So that could give us a clue about the profits. So before we look at the examples that he gives us, we know, or it's possible that we know that if you're borrowing money to do some investment, and therefore that's where interest rates come in, the rates at which you're borrowing should not be so high such that the returns that you get are lower than the costs of the loan. So you can only borrow money to invest into something if the returns will be higher than the cost, so that at least there's some profit or some returns that you make. And I think that can be reflected, that usually reflected in many economies or sectors, although some can be unique. That will be there. They'll be outliers. That when interest rates, and for our case here, central bank rates rise, and then interest rates rise, we are going to have a situation where there are less people now who are were able to access those loans, and therefore investments or stocks will decline, and that of course will reflect in the profits, because if we have a decline in stocks, then of course we're going to have lesser profits out of it. So he uses the example in his time and place, that's Britain, and he tells us that in Britain we have interest rates that were above 10%. And so what happened? Around that time, that was during the kingship of Henry the Eighth, the interest rates were capped at 10. Anything above 10% was declared to be unlawful. And in another era, just around the same time, we had a religious zeal that prohibited all interest. And in the same chapter, of course, he gives the example of religions that have a say or a problem with interest rates, like for instance the Muslim, and they call it okay, I'll get that name. So there's provision, they prohibit interest on loans. But this is the observation he makes, that this prohibition did not in any way produce, it did not in any way affect lending, because in fact now it encouraged the backdoor access of those loans, which were even charging now still higher than what was being said. So from this example that he gives us, we are able to see that even since those days, we had authorities limiting rates, sometimes lowering them, or the fluctuations through legal instruments. For us, so we know that very often we have the central bank, which lowers or maintains, that controls the interest rates. That's the CBR, the CBR rate for the case of Kenya. And if you look at this situation where we have the authorities that now regulate interest rates, then we have the situation where there's an interference with the assumptions or the observations that Adam Smith has made here, whereby if we have that, of course, he has made the claim, the strong position, he has taken that strong position that what affects interest rates then will be able to affect profits of capital. So when there's a capping, then therefore that of course will reflect in the profits. So he gives us the example of England, how that was lowered from 10 to 8 to 6 and many other rates, and he compares England to Scotland and France and also Holland. And he makes interesting observations that connects to the argument that Vivian has shown us, whereby we have, for example, before he even compares England to others, he notes that investing in towns, that is, in towns, in larger towns, would require more capital, that's more stocks compared to villages. And what happens in these great towns is that we'll have higher wages, and therefore that will affect the profits on stocks, because we have more people competing for, actually now, because of the great amounts of stocks. So we have more competition, and then we'll have that competition in labor, for labor, and that will affect the returns, the profits. Will determine the profits on stocks. And in villages, he says that it will require actually just lesser capital, that's lesser stock, and then we don't have a lot of competition for labor, and so lower costs in wages, and therefore higher profits on capital. So he compares that England to France and Scotland, and he says that the legal rates for England and Scotland were the same, but Scotland was poorer, so there was less capital and wages were lower, just confirming the argument that he has presented. France as well was cheaper, France as well was not as rich as England, but he says that now in France it was interesting, because he took another different view, that now these fluctuations in interest rates for France was for another intention, and that was to lower the cost of interests on public debts. And I think that's very relatable if we look at what's happening around, where the rates for the T-bills, the treasury bills, is now below, and actually we realize that is mostly on dates, on lowering the cost of interest on dates. So France was not as rich as England, and then we had lower interest, but again, wages were lower. But Holland, that's Netherlands. Oh yeah, of course, Holland is a region in Netherlands. It was richer than England, and rates were as low as 3. That's for government, and people of good standing were borrowing at around 4. So that means we had lower interest rates. So that really affected that will, of course, reflect in profits. But now when we had lower interest rates, and looking at this argument that it actually affects profits of stock or capital, people claim that now the country was decaying. And what observation now? What does he have to say about this argument? He says that merchants are very apt to complain that trade decays. Of course, that's when we have low interest and lower profits on stock. But for him, he thinks that actually when interest rates decline, then that's the natural effect of prosperity. And this is the argument. He says that because prosperity now has happened, we have more people putting their stock in different trades. So there's that competition. So there's that prosperity because we have more people doing the investments. We have higher wages for the workers. But now, even when of course the merchants, so we call them investors sometimes, for them, while the rate could be lower, but there are many, and therefore those profits are higher. But he makes another very important point, I think, which should be remembered very well here, is that higher profits of stock and higher wages hardly go together. but he says that's possible under peculiar circumstances. And he goes further to give examples like what used to happen in colonies, where actually we'd have interest as high as 40 or 6 or even 60%. And now because we have so that would affect the profits of stock in such circumstances. But that point he has insisted is that when stocks increase, that's when capital goes up, and then more investments, then would have the demand for labor. That's because there's more investments and therefore there's more demand for labor. So gives those examples of colonies, which I don't want to go much into that. But again, he brings something else that's important to foreign trade. And for that, I think that's a touch on FDIs. And just to quote him, that he says, a country which neglects or despises foreign commerce then cannot transact the same quantity of business which it might do with different laws for instance. In fact, I think making judgment on that, it simply means that there's need to open so that we have larger quantities of businesses. But even in this argument, monopolies are different because they don't have the competition, and we know competition that so there's no competition, and therefore that will mean we have higher profits determined by actually they have a bigger say in the profits and they have a bigger say in wages. So monopolies could have large profits. And as we have noted earlier that laws, legislations have been used to cap rates, then any defect, he says that a defect in law sometimes would raise interest rates above what is appropriate for the condition of a country at that time, and therefore affect wealth and poverty. And then he revisits again the issue of prohibiting interest altogether, and why that does not prevent people from getting interests, because according to him, people must borrow. So when even interest is prohibited, to borrow, and they'll pay even higher interest rates. So I think that's the main arguments that he's making here. It's the same things that affect that is wages, the fall in the price of wages, that will affect that's risks that affect profits on stock, but in a different way as he has demonstrated. And lastly, he says, lastly, just to quote him, again, revisiting merchants, that merchants can complain about the effects of high wages in raising the price, because of now the compounding effect that when there's higher wages, then this will have to be factored into the price of goods. But mostly, he says that they don't complain about higher profits. So they only favor their end, but they don't complain. But they complain when we have higher wages. So I think that with the application of so based on these arguments, I think it's relevant today looking at actually the interest rates and how that affects profits. Interest rates and the behavior of now access to capital. And so to having a central bank that regulates this, and we could have different reasons just besides the reasons that are obvious. We could have a reason like France. It was purely done to lower the interests on. So I think I'll rest back to you, Joseph.
Thanks, Jairus. That was quite lengthy, but very informative as well. Let me move to chapter 10, where we are looking at wages and profits in the different employments of labor and stock. And on this chapter, we have Fiona to take us through. Fiona, welcome.
Right. Thank you, Chacha. Please confirm that you can hear me.
Yeah, sure. I can hear you, but the sound seems to be a bit low.
Oh, really?
Mm.
And now?
Yeah, much better, much better.
Okay, so I think I'll stay next to the screen. Thank you so much to my previous colleagues, Jairus and Vivian, for your presentations, and Jairus as well for just laying the foundation in terms of chapter 10 and the discussions. So in this chapter, which is of the wages and profit in the different employments of labor and stock, here Smith starts by introducing us to the fact that if every single person in society could either freely choose a job, then the pay and the benefits would even out. So in reality, though, he argues that differences do exist because when you look at different jobs, they do feel different. And the fact that there are systems and rules from government that can get in the way. So he splits this 25-page chapter into two types of inequalities. So one is those inequalities that arise from the nature of the work itself, and then two from the policies of the government, and he uses Europe as a case study. So if we go to the first part, where he gives 5 circumstances in the nature of employments which lead to inequalities, the first one that he brings to the discussion is the agreeableness or disagreeableness of the employments themselves. So here he just basically argues that pay is not just about skill. It's about compensation for how enjoyable or respectable or tolerable someone finds a job, right? Or a worker in this case. So he argues that if it's enjoyable, then it means that it pays more. And then jobs with honor or status pay less than we would expect because the people who generally do the gross jobs or the brutal jobs that people don't like, such as now in his example, working in coal mines or being an executioner, do actually pay more. So just look at it in terms of the fact that there's demand for this specific labor, but not very many people are willing to supply it. Therefore, then the price is higher. But to me, I was just thinking about it and saying, okay, this doesn't seem to be the case in a lot of countries, especially anyway, whether they're developed or otherwise. Because his argument of, the unpleasant jobs pay more. But then when I look around, I'm thinking of the farm laborers, with the exception of when, there's a certain season. So whether it's harvesting or planting, when they charge more, or you look at domestic workers, you look at sanitation workers, who are actually the the least paid, right? And then some jobs are actually quite dangerous. And I think it's because these workers don't have an alternative. Then there are instances where labor supply is quite high. Therefore, compensation for this unpleasantness that he tries to bring in this first argument fails in practice. So the second point that he brings in is the easiness and cheapness, or the difficulty and expense of learning the job. So here he makes the comparison between learning a very difficult skill and also buying an expensive machine. So he says, you spend time, you spend effort, you spend money to be able to build that specific skill that you expect to earn back the cost, which is what you spent, plus the profit. And people generally, because they are rational, they're very unwilling to take so much time learning if they feel that the returns are not high. So the jobs that generally require minimal training to learn will pay little because the worker can always be replaced, right? So for this, think doctors versus maybe like a mason. Then the third point that he brings about is a constancy or inconstancy of employment. So here, his argument is that, when you look at stable jobs, they tend to pay less, while unstable jobs pay more. So if your job is not consistent, you need higher pay so that you're able to survive the days in which you're not at work, right? So he goes ahead and he argues that when this inconsistency in employment is then combined with extreme cases where jobs are dangerous, then the wages are much, much higher. So even when you come home to Kenya, that is, you can see that generally, like government jobs, they tend to have stability compared to, but then they have lower salaries or lower pay. Then the fourth point that he brings about is that the wages of labor vary according to the small or great trust which must be reposed in the workmen. So here, he's talking about the jobs that require people to trust you with valuable things, important decisions, or their well-being. Yeah. So those ones, he argues that they tend to pay more. So for this, let's look at jobs that involve handling valuable things or people's lives or reputations. And so he argues that those are workers that need to be reliable, they need to be respected, and they need to be seen as trustworthy. So think about it, someone who's handling your jewelry, or a doctor who, in this case, is handling your health, or a lawyer that you must trust with your reputation. So they would tend to be paid more. Bringing it back to today, think about the cybersecurity expert, right? So he earns a lot of money because these particular companies trust them with sensitive data, or in the case of like fund managers, if you're someone who invests your money, I mean, they handle millions or even billions per day. So we'll generally pay them quite a substantive amount of money. Then the fifth point that he raises is that the wages of labor vary according to the probability or improbability of success. So here he's basically arguing that people choose risky careers because they believe that they will succeed. But since there are so many people that tend to think like this, then the rewards are spread thin. So you see, some careers are pretty straightforward, like maybe starting a trade where it's a retail shop. So you buy something from China, or you buy it from the US, or whichever country of your choice, and then you come and you sell it. Yeah, so that's pretty easy to learn, right? But then if you train as, say, a shoemaker, you most definitely be able to earn a living from it. So, but there are careers in which he brings in the argument that it's a gamble. So think about something like sports, right? So a lot of people try, but only a few actually make it, right? Even from the people who are just listening to us today, I'm sure a lot of us are not sportsmen, and we've not been from the time we were young. So even if we try sports, only the best and the most, I guess, physically endowed with the speed, if you have to run and all of that, are actually the ones that are going to make it. So now here's the key idea that Smith brings about. So because so many people fail, the few who do succeed are expected to really earn a lot of it, a lot of money, sorry. So it's like winning a lottery, right? Which is the example that he actually uses in the book. So the winner takes the reward that could have gone to everyone else. But in reality, it doesn't fully balance out. So overall, people in these risky careers don't often earn as much as you'd expect, considering the time it takes, the money, the effort. Again, just going back to our example of a sportsman, you have to think about their diet, their training regimen, and all of that, right? And so they have to spend a considerable amount of time and maybe money, the coach and all of that that they invest. So relatively, probably they don't earn much, or so he says. So then he goes into trying to answer a question. So why do people still go into them? So there are two major reasons that he shows us in the book. So first, it's because of status and recognition. So people like the idea of being successful and also admired. And I think you can see that a lot also with like the Generation Alpha and the Gen Zs. They seem to really want to do all of these things so that they can be successful. People can know them. They can be admired. So they would tend to probably try to go into this risky jobs. So the second reason then he gives is overconfidence. So most people think I'll be the one who makes it, right? So even if the odds are low, I as Fiona, I'll be the one who will make it from my village, from my country, from wherever, right? I am the one that people will know that I've actually made it in YouTube. And so I find that especially now, right, Smith's argument is very true. So you look at YouTubers, for example, or even athletes, once again, there are millions of people who try, but only a small percentage succeed. So for example, you see someone like, I hope everyone knows Mr. Beast, yeah? So he makes massive income from YouTube. But then the millions, if not thousands of other creators make very little or nothing. So to summarize his first part, he says that even though workers' wages can be different, profits between businesses are usually pretty similar. So out of all the reasons that affect wages, he only two really actually affect profits. So one is the agreeableness or disagreeableness of the business, and then two, and the risk or security with which it is attended, and even then not by much. So that's what he says. So in some place, most businesses tend to make around the same level of profit overall. Now, sometimes it looks like certain businesses are making way more money than the rest, but it seems that, according to him, he says that it seems that this can be misleading to conclude that. So he gives us an example of something basically like a pharmacist, right? So it might seem like they're making a lot of money from the purchase of this particular medicine, but Smith argues that in reality, a lot of that money is just paying for the skill and the responsibility. So it's not really profit. It's more like their wages just built into that price. Yeah. So same thing with a small shopkeeper. So he might be making 40 or 50% profit, while a big merchant, and normally this I think are the profit ranges, even for manufacturers, get about 10% to 8%. But then you think about the shopkeeper, who runs the shop, he manages everything. So part of that profit is actually just their income for working. So once you separate the actual profit from payment for labor, it turns out that most businesses are earning pretty similar returns, or that's what he argues. So even though different jobs and businesses, they pay different amounts, if you zoom out and look at everything, so money, right? How hard is a job? How risky is it? How stable is it? All of this kind of balances out. So like, if a job ends up paying less, it's probably easier or stable, right? think government jobs. And if a job pays more, then there's usually some sort of catch. So it's harder, it's riskier, it's less secure. So overall, then the pros and the cons start to cancel each other out. But also Smith, towards the end of this part one, he brings in an interesting perspective. So he says, for this to actually work out, it has to do so under certain conditions. So first, the job has to be well known and it has to be established. So if it's a new job, things don't balance out yet, right? A new business, for instance, will probably have higher wages so that they can attract more people to come and work with them. It will probably have bigger profits, right, from the start. But then over time, more people join in, competition increases, and everything settles back down to normal. So new opportunities then, we would say and conclude, are kind of unstable at first, but then after some time, they level out. So the second point, again, he brings in is that things have to be in their normal state. So sometimes demand suddenly changes and that throws everything off. So let's think about a farm. So it's during harvest time and all of us are harvesting or our maize, our dengus, which is green grams, all of these things we are harvesting, right? Or maybe he gives an example of sailors as well. So they get paid more during wartime because there just aren't enough of them. So then, because I could work in Jotham's farm, for instance, or I could work in Vivian's farm, or I could work in Jairus's farm or Emmanuel's farm, I'm on high demand because it's harvest season. So of course, then this is not the norm throughout the year. So I could actually get more wages than I would have during a period where it's just like Fiona wants me to come to her farm and plant. Yeah. So I hope that makes sense. Then the third conclusion that he makes is that this has to be someone's main job. So if people have other sources of income, they're often willing to work for less. Like someone who has a small piece of land and just does extra work on the side, or someone who knits during their spare time. They don't fully depend on that job, so they can accept a lower pay. And then that ends up making that kind of work cheaper than normally it would be. So to wrap up part one, because there is part two, I bring it back home to today. And one of the things that I feel this part of the chapter doesn't cover is that I don't feel like it accounts for systemic biasness. So what do I mean? So you look at modern labor markets. Clearly, one of the conversations we've had constantly is gender pay gaps, where, yeah, I'm a woman, you're a man, same skill set, but for some reason, because I'm a lady, then I'm paid less money. Then there's also the element of racial or ethnic inequities, which are a reality. There are certain countries, because you hail from this race, then we'll pay you less. But we're doing the same job, we have the same skill set, we've got to, we've gone to probably even the same schools, like same everything, but you get paid more than me for one reason or another. The second thing is that I feel like, which is not a bad thing, but Smith imagines a competitive market. So today you look at big firms which dominate industries and they're capable of suppressing wages simply because as a worker you might end up having few alternatives, especially for this really high-skilled jobs. Of course, you would pay more, but maybe you would actually get more. But because they know it's either you work here at the IEA or either you work Organization X. I was about to just name another organization, but Organization X. So therefore, you only have like, say, 3 options. So then they can decide to suppress your wages. The third point is, it seems that then he assumes that people understand job risks, the pay levels, career prospects. But most of the time we have something that's called information asymmetry. So information is not perfect. So in reality, then as citizens of this world, we just make decisions with limited or misleading information. So now let's go to the second part of the chapter. So here, he brings in that inequality in wages and profits is what he calls the policies of Europe, right? So here his main argument is that inequality in wages and profits is not natural. It's also man-made, right? So specifically, he says European policies, so these are your laws, the guilds and the regulations, they mess up the natural balance of the market. So how do they do that? By three ways. So one, government restricts competition. So it makes it harder for people to enter a certain job. Two, they force too much competition in other jobs. And three, they block movements of workers and capital. So let me explain. So the first one, where it's restricting competition. So here you can see Smith is not a fan of guilds and apprenticeship laws, basically because the early versions of it just registers professional gatekeeping. So because what was happening is I just can't start a trade. I must serve under like an apprenticeship. And mostly this would take like 7 years. Then I would have to follow strict rules about training, and then I would have to be approved by a corporation. And he argues, rightfully so, that these rules are not about quality, but they are about limiting competition. In fact, he writes it beautifully by saying that, there are certain jobs or skills that you don't require 7 years to learn. I mean, you can learn them much faster. And then he shows that this apprenticeship system was a waste of time. So you keep young workers poor, you discourage productivity, and then he claims that the real quality control from market mechanism is based on reputation, product standards, and definitely not long training. Then he brings in a bigger idea that your ability to work is actually your own property. So if the government of the day or a group is stopping you from working in a job that you are capable of doing, that's basically taking away your freedom. So he points out that the people in the same trade tend to work together to protect themselves, even casually. So they'll end up limiting competition and also trying to raise prices so that, they maximize as possible from partaking or engaging in a particular trade. And to make it worse, then the law comes along and supports it, or the guilds come and support it. And then now that even makes it even stronger. So finally, he says, these rules are not about protecting the public, but they're actually protecting the insiders. And today, I think we can even see that with licenses, where one cannot operate in a certain profession without it. Let me give an example, and I think a lot of us can remember this case. I think there was a young man who was an excellent lawyer. I guess he got caught, and he had not trained as an advocate, but he had won so many cases in this country for a lot of people, only for it to be discovered, yeah, he's not even a lawyer. Now you see, for instance, he can do this job very well. He's won cases for people, but because he doesn't have the license to practice, then he's told, okay, no, you can't. And yeah, so then he goes to his second point, right? So which is on forcing too much competition in other jobs. So before he was showing us, so these are how the rules can block people from entering jobs. Now he says that sometimes the system does the reverse. So it pushes too many people in a certain job. So this happens through, for instance, think scholarships, think bursaries, public funding for education, yeah? And if you remember, even when Kibaki came in, one of the things that came along with him was free primary education. And you now, because I was in a public school for some time, I think during that time, and us guys were like, I think 30, 35 in a class. And then so this comes in and it's like so many people joining, which is okay. But then you can see how then that if all of this graduates, and we'll talk about it later, then you can see that posing as now competition increasing because of the number of people who are graduating later, right? So yes, indeed, true. The basis was that you're trying to help more people, but then now they end up flooding certain professions with workers. So too many workers, intense competition, sorry, and then the wages drop. So even if that education is long and work is respectable, then the pay ends up being surprisingly low. Now, he adds another layer, which is status. So even though the pay is low, people are still willing to go into these professions. Why? Because they are respected, they have a chance of landing a high-paying position later. So he actually calls it kind of a lottery. So where very few people get rich at like the very top positions, and then most people just stay purely poorly paid. And so let's think about it even today with university degrees. So data as of 2025 shows that Kenya is actually pushing about 50,000 students who graduate annually, but only less than 40% of this category transition smoothly into the workforce. And again, just to bring it home, because we are social media people, the other day I saw a video of a young man who was top of his class in KCSE, and then he went ahead to study in uni. I think it was medicine or something. And then he even graduated with first class honors, right? But now what is he doing? He's actually selling secondhand clothes. And people who are just, encouraging in the comment section, the spirit of Kenyan spirit, which is very good. So they're just trying to encourage him. And this is a guy probably, I don't know, 20 or 30 years, or maybe during Smith time, he would have just been the doctor that he wanted to be. But because we are channeling out so many doctors, a lot of them are just now, instead of staying home, thinking about doing something else. But then Smith ends up admitting something interesting, that this might not be all bad for society, because as a whole, we are benefiting from having a lot of educated people. So his third point, and I'm almost done, his third point is, even if wages are different across jobs or places, the system should fix itself, but it doesn't, because people aren't allowed to move freely. So this means that in a normal free system, if I feel that one job pays more, then I just move there, right? Or if I feel like a certain place, maybe I'm an economist, but economists in Uganda, for instance, are paid better than the ones in Kenya. So I just relocate, and that would balance everything out. But then, because remember, his example was in Europe, he argues that England actually did stop people from moving. So you can't switch trades easily as that. And then you can't also move to a new place for work. Then he talks about something very specific in England, which is the settlement laws. Basically, what it did was it controlled where poor people were actually allowed to live and work. So each area called a parish is responsible for its poor people. So the reason that they did not want outsiders coming in and becoming a burden is because they were taking care of their poor people. So if you move to a new place, you can actually be forced to move out. Unless, of course, you are rich or you have money or things like those, then you could stay because you're not a liability to them. So here he just says that, basically this is a violation of basic freedom. And that's chapter 10. Very beautiful chapter by Smith. And yeah, I hope that we have learned something from it. Thank you so much, Jotham. Back to you.
Thanks, Fiona. Sure, it's one of the longest chapters in book one. To end the day down now on book one, we want to look at chapter 11, the rent of land. And welcome, Emmanuel, to take us through the chapter.
Thank you. Thanks, Jotham. Let me, oops. So this is also one of the longer chapters in this book, The Rent of the Land. And this is one chapter where Adam Smith dives into political economy. And one of the important points that Adam Smith makes in this chapter is to characterize the different strata of society in terms of the ownership of the factors of production, and then to give a warning to society about what incentives the owners of these different factors of production actually pose to society. So what he says, property of the nation is explicitly linked to or contributes to the prosperity of the land, or that is the land owner, land being one of the factors of production. He says that unfortunately, the landowner, because he earns a passive income, an income that doesn't have to do anything to generate, this status creates in him a certain ignorance about the workings of the world and a lack of curiosity about and understanding of the relationship between the laws of the land, the prosperity of the land, or rather the laws of the nation, the prosperity of the nation and his own prosperity. Okay, how is this? Well, the point is that as the nation gets wealthier, prices rise, and those who are renting from land must pay higher rents. And so Adam Smith is saying that the landlord should be more interested in running the country and should be entrusted with running the country, but then he is not because he's ignorant. We'll examine how true this remains 250 years later in a second. Now to the other two, the owners of labor. To the owners of labor, Adam Smith also ascribes a certain inherent nobility. Right? He says that owners of labor, because their prosperity is linked to, is tied to the prosperity of the nation. As the nation gets wealthier, they get wealthier. So it is because it is in their interest that the nation grow wealthy. They should also be entrusted with running the land, the nation, and in making its laws. But unfortunately, they suffer both from ignorance about how the world works and how the law works, but that also they are so oppressed by the day-to-day struggle for survival that they just don't have the time, the bandwidth to engage with lawmaking. So what happens? They are used by the third class of people, the merchants. They're exploited in the process of lawmaking. How? Because the prosperity of the land is actually inverse to the prosperity, at least I think it's in relative terms. Let's put it this way. As a nation gets wealthier, entrepreneurs' profits, the owner of capital, their profits actually shrink. So because their profits shrink, they have an interest in market concentration. So Adam Smith proposes this, that they should not be trusted because every law they propose is towards concentrating the market in their favor. Their every move should be looked upon with suspicion. And so, by the same token, they exploit the owner of labor in trying to convince them to also support laws that are in favor of the capitalist, the owner of capital. So, is this still true 250 years later? Well, when you look at it, starting with the landlords or the landowners today deploy the highest human capital available in their market analyses, in their employment of lobbyists, in their lobbying efforts. That is, their strategies are developed and executed by the cutting edge of human capital and even capital, right? The types of technology that they can deploy to both assess the value of land and influence the laws related to the ownership of land. Their capacities and their capabilities have increased manifold, maybe many more times than Adam Smith envisioned in his time, right? Judging from the conclusions that he made in this chapter, so that we would say that you wouldn't just scrutinize the laws written by the merchants, but you would also scrutinize the laws written, proposed, or backed by the owners of land. They too have incentives to make laws that are in their favor. As for the owner of labor, well, in a way, what Adam Smith said sort of remains true to this day, except that the owners of today have greater access to information, higher levels of education. They can ascertain a bit more about what's going on. You know, we have the example of the finance bill protests in Kenya, sort of showed that owners of labor were more privy to the lawmaking and the laws that would adversely affect them, specifically tax laws, than perhaps was envisioned here. But all that being said, right, the other two classes, the merchants, the master manufacturers that he also mentioned, the owners of land, who themselves can even generate higher rents by developing the land, all have high concentrations of power relative to the other sector of society and an outsized ability to influence the law. So what else does Adam Smith claim in this chapter? So to begin with, so land rents are fundamentally different from wages and profit. Wages are revenues earned by labor, profit revenues earned by ownership of capital, and that when market demand is high for those goods produced by laborers and owners of capital, wages and profits are also high, and landowners can then charge higher rents on against laborers and owners of capital. So, for example, a farmhand and a farmer, representing the owner of capital and the farmer, the owner of labor in the farmhand. If there's a high demand for the farm goods that they are producing, then they will earn higher wages because, as explored in previous chapters, they will charge the consumer for bringing these goods to market. Then the landlord turns around and says, you can afford more, I will ask for more. So rents are actually a function of prices. That is how a wealthy nation, right? Because a wealthy nation is a nation where, because in a wealthy nation, prices are high because people are wealthy enough to afford those high prices, then landlords enjoy higher rents. This is also true of wealthier regions. Now, if the farmer and the worker have nothing to bring home, they have no surplus, then there's no rents for the landlord to claim, and he gets zero. So Adam Smith then went on to divide land produces into different separate categories. He's tried to explain why some land is expensive, right? Some rents are high and others are not. First place, there's the sort of things that land produces. The things that nature produces and that man can't multiply. So, for example, rare birds or a location on the coastline. So these there are some things that are expensive just because of these things that the land produces that man cannot reproduce. So the prices of or rather the rents charged on this land are only limited by what those who are consuming for luxury can afford. So their limit, actually, they have no limit except what these consumers can afford. The second type of land is a land that produces things that humans can multiply through industry, like cattle or poultry. So the price, the prices of these things are determined by the cost of production. And so the rent charged on land that produces the kinds of things that humans can multiply through industry is dependent on demand. So in a wealthy country, these sort of things will the price, because the price of these things can fluctuate, then the rents on this sort of land will also fluctuate. So the third sort of things are things for which human industry is limited or uncertain. So things like wool, hides, and fish and minerals are examples. So because minerals depend on accidental discovery, there is the price of these products is dependent on how much of it do we discover. It doesn't have much to do with what men produce. So, or rather, their influence in the equation it's limited or it's uncertain. So, because the price depends on accidental discovery, the rent also is dependent on accidental discovery. So, after Adam Smith made this distinction between these three types of land, he made a detour into the market for silver because he wanted to make a point about nominal prices. Since this chapter is talking about rent, the rent is the revenue, the returns from land. What he is trying to do by exploring the variations in the price of silver is to explain that this type of land, the type of land from which silver is extracted, is dependent on the demand for silver. So the price of silver tells us nothing about real output. Okay, so let's put it like this. a landowner owns a piece of land that has silver in it. If that landowner doesn't have access to foreign markets, and then domestically industry is there's not a lot of food surplus, the rent from this land will remain very low. But then if there's demand for silver, domestically or abroad, then the landowner rents the land, because now in mining, the rents charged to those producing whatever is extracted from the ground, as we discussed prior, the rent being determined by prevailing prices. The price of silver must exceed the cost of its production, its extraction, and its transportation. When the costs fall below the cost of labor to extract, the cost of tools that are used in the extraction of silver, the cost of its transportation, if since it's a light mineral, well, the producer no longer wants to produce the silver, and rents will fall to zero. So we look at this from another higher direction and ask the question, how does land become valuable to begin with? Well, when you have a nation where productivity is very low, so there's very low surplus, which means what? Because we have to eat food, the first thing that we as people do is to try and produce food. After we've produced this food, and we produce enough of it in excess, then we can enter into the consumption of what Adam Smith called I think he uses a term similar to trinkets, so ornaments like silver, things that are not food. When we enter into the consumption of these things, then suddenly the other resources that come from the land, whether it's stone from quarries or trees, timber, suddenly become more valuable, and we have the capacity to extract them, arising from the demand for them. Then the rents start to rise. So either the country becomes wealthier, or it gains access to international markets. So this is how, for example, the land can be valuable through foreign direct investment or foreign trade, even when a country is relatively poor. Now, as a nation becomes more productive, the intensity of knowledge going into manufacturing means that over time, manufacturers fall in price. As manufacturers fall in price, and the intensity of land use rises also from highly productive agricultural activities, then we also see that the price of livestock relative to crops starts to rise, because we're dedicating less and less land towards grazing and more land towards agriculture. The livestock becomes more scarce, and then we see a rise in their price over time. So now, having explored how rent is determined, the one of the points that Adam Smith made was that he colored land rents as sort of a monopoly. But and does this still hold 250 years later? Not quite. And because of globalization and trends in technology and communication, actually, although some of these trends still hold, where you have a place like San Francisco where the land is very expensive because of the increase in wealth and the increase in productivity from say information technology related activities. One countervailing force is that employers can actually place their workers elsewhere to work remotely and forego the necessity of paying rent. But even without this, and even before remote work, those paying rent could still go to cheaper places and force the rents lower. Now, what else makes or what else generates demand for land? Adam Smith makes a point about institutions and the way that they contribute to security and how this also drives the demand for land. So, regions or locales that are unsafe, with a lot of information asymmetry, they will see that rents actually fall because individuals are looking for land for different reasons, including the security that's being offered. And in the present day, you can even look when you look at the parallels of both land and silver, right? And the wealthy in spending their surplus also look to consuming silver, and they look to consuming silver because it serves as a security, right? Trying to preserve their wealth. In the present day, we see similar flights of capital towards what? Towards locales, administrative locales that are safer. Like in Kenya, we talk about nataka kwenda majuu. You want to go basically to a place that's more stable. Not only do people want to go majuu, but they also want to earn in dollars or secure assets in dollars, right? In this very same way that they wanted to consume silver as they got richer. Where else? Where or in what places does Adam Smith find himself disproven by the passage of time? So Adam Smith claimed that food producing land always pays rent because there's always demand for food, which is one of the earlier points we made. But in the present day, in a globalized world, we find that some land, it's so difficult for it to pay rent based on food production without government subsidy, simply because foreign competition is so high. It's the disparity in productivity between countries that's making it so that some land just doesn't pay rent. Okay, but Adam Smith did himself make that point about how landlords can exploit global trade to generate rents on land that wasn't being consumed by the domestic market. So here we see what happens when there are distortion, when the differential in productivity is just extremely extreme. So what does this chapter actually mean for the wealth of nations? For one, we can see that land becomes more productive as the intensity of knowledge increases, as the people become more productive. But because the owners of land and owners of land can actually develop that land and deploy capital, they themselves don't have, and they don't necessarily wait for how do we put this? Land, although land is scarce, the landlord or the landowner can actually claim more value from the land by building into the sky. Right? By building vertically, they can rent more spaces within those apartments. So they don't have to wait for perhaps a more accurate way to put it is, if a region has a high intensity of knowledge, high level of productivity, the landlord can actually claim more and more of that productivity by developing into the sky. If on the side of lawmaking, the types of laws that generate productivity, if we look at the rule of law, which is a point that Adam Smith makes in this chapter, the rule of law, property rights, limited government. So we can consider a government that is not being captured by, say, those who are seeking rents from the government, so to speak in political economy terms. And finally, where the regulations are efficient. So the regulations are not being exploited by merchants or master manufacturers, the term that he uses, which is simply to say industrialists. Then such a nation becomes wealthier, and all the three classes are able to claim more. So the owners of labor earn higher wages, the owners of capital generate higher profits, and the owners of the land, after these things have happened, as the land becomes wealthier, they can claim higher rents. That's the end of this chapter. Thank you.
Thanks, Emmanuel. Yeah, unfortunately, we have overshot our time. Hey, it's about 30 minutes, about half an hour up and above the time we wanted to spend. Even though I want to give each of us maybe a minute or two to give the conclusion remark on the chapters, the chapter that one is responsible for. In your remark, please, in conclusion, help us understand, are proclamations of Adam Smith in the chapter that you have been able to delve in relevant to today or to today's world, and we agree with the proclamations. So it's basically giving us a summation, and that will help us close down today's episode. So you're free to turn on your cameras, each one of us, because it's a moment of discussion. So, and I will begin following the same order that we were appearing then. So I will start with Vivian. Please note you have 1 or 2 minutes at most, max. Please share your take on the wages of labor, Vivian.
Okay, thank you very much, Chacha. So to answer your question, these concepts still apply to date, and we see them in different ways. Now, four takeaways or some of the things to remember in the 8th chapter is that what Smith is telling us that are still applicable today is that wage differences across places and even time is explained by differences in economic conditions. So like when an economy is growing, we'll be able to see high wages. When an economy is stagnant in growth, there'll be either stable or low wages. Then when it is declining, very low wages. Then we also understand that poverty and low wages reduces the workers' productivity, well-being, and also undermine the performance of the economy. So many people are incentivized when wages are high, and we see that all through. When wages are low, you can go to an hospital and find people are reluctant because they are not incentivized, they are not motivated, they are not productive because the wages are very low. Then high wages often reflects a strong demand for labor. It's not a sign of inefficiency. Then lastly, so conditions of workers is not best in richest countries. So people do mistake that when a country is rich, then the condition for its workers are best. So it is not often best in the richest country, but in those countries whose economies are growing. So it brings a strong correlation between growth and labor productivity and also high wages. Thank you. So that's the conclusion on that chapter.
Thanks, Vivian. No, that's great. Jairus, the profits of stock.
Okay, thanks, Chacha. I think I've thrown just a few points. Though I could do more, but what applies today, I think, according to Adam Smith, and actually looking at our case, like for Kenya in the world today, you realize that it makes sense to say that we could look at interest rates to be able to get a clue on the performance of profits for the people he calls merchants. I know Fiona would call them investors. Depends on the different trades. And then another very important point that you mentioned was that it was hard to estimate the average profits, and he said actually they vary by year. Of course, they vary by country. They vary by the trades or the industries people choose to invest. They vary by year, month. He even went ahead and said even probably by hour. So that was hard, but referred us to just look at these interest rates. And then even as we are interested to understand the profits of stock, it's also clear that today in many economies, we have institutions that regulate the interest rates. Sometimes it's to protect us, and sometimes just to ensure that, to control other things. For example, the CBR has an effect on inflation and a lot of other things. Yeah, so we have that. And the case for what happened for France, where actually rates were lowered, primarily to, of course, looking at this argument, there is that impression that lower interest rates would mean that we have more capital. I mean, lower profits would mean that we have more capital, and of course, that also shows itself in interest rates. But we also see that just as it happened in France, where these rates were lowered, and one of the main thing was just to cut on interest rates on public debt, that's still happening in some economies today. And lastly, which I think would be very important to take home, would be on where people choose now to put their capital, and that's why we see that people would prefer trades that promise higher returns, including even offshoring, like investing in other countries or different industries, and even now abandoning investment in some industries in preference for others because of profits. So because Kenya, like in our where we fall in when you rank economies as a developing country, and therefore with the higher interest, we could see this potential for investment from people from high income countries, and you could see that through looking at FDIs and FDIs and public actually. Even I think that would be important. That's the point, that we have people from or industries from high income countries or developed countries now preferring to put some investments here because of higher returns. So that's what I think still applies today. Yes, and I hope you'll give me another chance to maybe say another word. If you'll not, maybe I can say now. But if you will,
Please
then
say
I can
now,
give
because
the mic back to
we
you.
ran 3 minutes. Okay.
What did you
Thanks,
say?
Yeah, you better say now. Otherwise, we have
Okay,
no any
okay.
other moment for you. But you have a minute.
Okay. Lastly, I think what I'll just say, I think I'll touch on what Fiona said. Actually, while it will be important to look at these profits on stocks, and as I said, it's difficult to get that average. But again, at his time, there are some innovations that were not even conceptualized. And so I think if he was writing today, and I think Fiona will, because she's our Adam Smith of today, the innovations in technology and AI, I think that will also change some or change the way we look at the argument he made here, especially on greater capital and how that affects wages, the rise of the wages of labor. Yes, and I think also, for now, I'll do that for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Jairus. We move on to Fiona. Wages and profit in the different employment of labor and stock.
Yes. Thank you, Jotham. I think my concluding remarks would also be similar to what Smith alludes to. So he ends this chapter by saying that, people have been trying to regulate wages in very many words, but people have been trying to regulate wages for hundreds of years, and it just doesn't work. So if we were to compress Smith's whole argument from this chapter today in Kenya, it just means that when we look at the wages and opportunities in Kenya, they're not determined just by your skill or your effort. They are shaped by very many things. So the training systems, the oversupply of graduates in that particular job market that you're in, the institutional barriers that come even from government, and even uneven access to opportunities between urban and rural areas. So case in point, and one of the things that I would like us to think about even as we end, is this element of government setting minimum wages. And I think the last ones that were revised were in 2025. So for example, they want to determine how much we pay domestic workers. And you can see that very few employers are willing to oblige by that. And today, we actually, in Kenya now, we have an influx of other nationalities from the East African region. It's not necessary for me to state the specific countries of origin, but it's not a secret. You can tell where most of our domestic workers are now coming from. And even in the construction site, there have been conversations about, before the laborers would be paid like 800 shillings, sorry. And now they're being paid as low as 400 shillings because of these nationalities that have come in. So you can see there are very many other factors that determine just the labor and the wages market in Kenya. And then another thing that he said that I had forgotten to mention is that when you look at some of these arguments that he was making, they mostly would apply to the market towns and not the villages. And this goes back to the first conversation we had, where in chapter 3, we were discussing about specialization of labor and how in the town areas, because of the demand for that particular labor, it makes a lot of sense to be able to specialize. Say, I can be able to specialize as a carpenter, for instance. But then now in the rural areas, because of the low demand for my product, I'm forced to be like a jack of all trades, if I can say that. So you find that then this whole idea of have an apprentice for 7 years, or have only 2 apprentices or one at a particular time, or limit in terms of licenses, only could work when it's an urban market. But then in the rural areas, if I know how to make a phone, trust me, people will bring those phones to me, even if I have never stepped in a TVET that teaches me simple, I think it's electronics in TVET, but you get the point. So yeah, I thank you so much, Jotham, even for this opportunity to be able to present on my chapter. Thank you.
Thanks, Fiona. Last, we go to Emmanuel. The rent of land. Emmanuel.
Yeah. Okay. So Adam Smith here takes all that he's explored and tries to explain what happens to the 3 strata of society as it gets wealthier, and so what happens to the revenues they earn, and then what happens to their relationship with different goods in the market. So and then finally with their relationship with governance. So he says that when a society is just at its most basic, very unproductive, they could have all the resources on the land, trees, rocks, minerals, precious stones, coal, and all that, right? All this energy. But because they don't have the level of the requisite productivity to exploit them, then the returns in terms of rent will be very low. So it's like saying that rents will be low if wages and profits are low, and wages and profits will be low when productivity is low. And when productivity is low, the people are mostly preoccupied with trying to meet their basic needs of food. So everything's people start their existence with food. But then now, as productivity increases and they can afford what he starts to call ornaments, well, now they can actually consume uh, uh, more, right? They get into more and more manufacturing, and more manufacturing means what? It means that you can use the land and strip it of its trees, or strip it of its coal, or say put a house at the beach and someone will actually pay a lot more for it. So you can see that the relationship between the people and the land is starting to change as they get wealthier. And then he says he starts to observe different things about how these different classes of people that he's organized interact with the economy, with the market. He says that now laborers and capitalists are earning more. So the landlord says, I'm going to charge more. But the landlord isn't doing anything in Adam Smith's view. He just owns land. So he can say that because you like beautiful birds and you're now rich and you like things like paying for beautiful birds, I'm going to charge you more just to have this land on which sit beautiful birds. Just because you like houses on the beach, I'm going to charge you more to enjoy the house on the beach. So he claims then that landlords will do nothing but earn a lot. But then in the modern day, you find that actually landlords will do a lot to develop the land and even earn more from it. So they're not lazy in the sense that he painted them in his time for whatever reasons he had to make those observations. Now, as they get wealthier, they also start to consume things like silver. There was a claim that by historians in his time that as societies were getting wealthier, the silver was actually had been losing value. So these historians had looked at the Romans and looked at all these different societies, and they thought that the price of silver was falling. But he made a point to correct them and say we shouldn't be asking about the nominal. We made a mistake. He says that historians in this time were making a mistake of confusing nominal and real prices. And what they should have been asking is, what could people actually, how much output could they command? Now, given that he goes into that segue to explain the important mistake that they made in their claim about societies getting wealthier and then the prices of certain non-essential goods like silver falling. He said, no, they don't fall. That you need to look at the real price. Now, the final point is this. As societies get wealthier, he thought that each of these classes had different incentives in terms of influencing the governance structure of the land. And he claimed that merchants were the most pernicious or most tempted to write laws that would give them more market concentration so that they can charge higher for their goods and claim higher profit. That he thought this because for merchants, as the country gets wealthier, they actually get poorer. But for laborers and landowners, as the country gets wealthier, they get wealthier. So they should be more trusted in terms of running the land than the merchants. But we find that in the modern day, this isn't actually true. So if we look at where Kenya, a country like Kenya is, for example, we actually find that landowners, first of all, many of them didn't even acquire the land through, say, market mechanisms, right? Through fairness, by buying the land, but actually just put it in their pocket in other ways. Not only did they do that and put it in their pocket, they also so by putting this land in their pocket, they've actually engineered a market concentration. And then they go ahead and use this power to write laws. And they sometimes can use this wealth generated by putting land in their pockets to become those master manufacturers that Adam Smith warned about. and also become the merchants and increase their market concentration and rewrite the laws of the land. The point that he did make about institutions actually stands, that if you have low regulation, efficient regulation, a small government, which we don't have in Kenya, right, limited government and freer markets, then the people become wealthier. But what you actually find is that because the landowners, who also became the merchant class, are able to write laws and concentrate the market, they actually create a state so bloated, and they come back and claim more from the state and then claim more from the people by raising taxes. And so they created another, quote unquote, it's like a piece of real estate. The state became a piece of real estate on which they come and claim more rents by capturing the state. And so the one class of people that remain mostly innocent, sort of in this 250 years, are probably the owners of labor. And that his observation that they're so encumbered by just living for survival that they don't have time to engage in governance or to understand it, mostly remains true in what we can see in the present day. And the final point being, when you have this kind of a state of affairs that produces a insecurity in life, then people seek flight to where the land, they can own property that is safe and secure, and they look for securities that are safe and secure. So in the same way they looked for silver in that age, today they would look for American securities, and then they look to move abroad. Thank you.
Thanks, Emmanuel. Thanks, everyone, Vivian, Fiona, Jairus, for an excellent job. By the final remark of Emmanuel, we conclude book 1 of Adam Smith's writing. Beginning next week, we'll be moving to book 2. In subsequent episodes, book 2 will look at the nature, accumulation, and employment of stock. Thank you so much, colleagues, and enjoy your evening. Bye, and thank you.